I noticed that you clapped for him, but not when I walked out. Huh? I'll remember that. I'll remember that. My name, not that you care, obviously, is Christopher Buckley, and it is my honor and privilege and delight to introduce Dr. Henry Kissinger, which immediately presents me with the problem, how does one introduce Dr. Henry Kissinger? Last week, the New York Times ran a story under the headline, "Uncertain Future Awaits the Most Remote of Amazon Tribes." And I thought to myself that this most remote of the Amazon tribes may be the only human beings on Earth unaware of the existence of Henry Kissinger. I do not plan to recapitulate Dr. Kissinger's curriculum vitae, which is lengthier than the Bayeux Tapestry, which for the record is 246 feet long. I will be brief, and if you will indulge me, personal. Henry Kissinger was one of the great friends of my late father, William F. Buckley, Jr. That friendship began in 1954, when the name Henry Kissinger was known only among the less remote of the Amazon Indian tribes. Their friendship was one of my father's enduring passions. On the morning in 2008 when my father died, my first call was to his sister, my Aunt Priscilla. The second call was to my father's oldest friend, the English historian, Alistair Horn, who, as it happens, is one of the 500 biographers of Henry Kissinger. And my third phone call was to Henry. 11 months earlier, I had asked him to give a eulogy at my mother's memorial service. And now I found myself asking him to give a eulogy for my father at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Afterwards, I said to Henry, "We can't go on meeting this way." So my admiration for Henry Kissinger has less to do with his stature as one of the great figures of the 20th and indeed 21st century. It is rooted in my admiration for his extraordinary capacity for friendship, for his warm German heart. And no, that is not an oxymoron. And for the loyalty and devotion that he lavishes so generously on those he loves and who love him. I'm honored and grateful to be included in that company as a collateral beneficiary of a friendship begun 6 decades ago and which continues into the next generation to this day. Ladies and gentlemen, Henry Kissinger.
The friendship with Bill Buckley was one of the seminal events of my life. We started out by my turning down an article he had written for a Harvard magazine that I was editing. And we survived its beginning. And through all of our lives, from then on, we, at least I can say, he was an enormous emotional support, knowing that there was somebody with his values who would fight for fundamental principles and on whom one could always rely. I had some trouble with being interviewed by Christopher. It's sort of being interviewed by your son. And I want to stress that my friendship with Bill was deep. My friendship with Christopher is not inherited. It stands on its own feet and is as deep as it was with his father. So I'm honored to be here. Now, I've been asked to make some remarks about foreign policy. And I think it will work best if I give you a sort of philosophical sketch of what I think the basic challenges are. And then Christopher and you can ask me questions about specific problems that are before us.
I should, excuse me for interrupting, I should mention Dr. Kissinger will talk. I'll interview him with a few follow-up questions. And then if you have questions, would you please write them down on the cards that have been supplied and pass them down so that Dr. Kissinger can have the occasion to answer them after.
And I understand Edmund Morris is selecting them. So
yes, which is
hostile questions have a great chance of being passed on to me.
Edmund's job is to redact the questions the way the CIA redacts Freedom of Information requests. So there'll probably be a lot of thick black lines through them.
Now, if you ask the question of which of Edmund's books I like best, you have a good chance of it reaching the stage. So the overriding challenge of our time is this. We always talk about world order and about the principles of world order that are either being supported or not. But the fact is, there has never been a world order. There has never been an international system in which all of the regions of the world participated at the same time as actors. During the colonial periods, there were, of course, occasions when the European views were dominant and Europe was sort of establishing the international order. The challenge of our time is that, in fact, historically, the various regions of the world have generally conducted their policies substantially in isolation from each other. The challenge of our time is that now technology and, in some sense, values are bringing them together, but that there is no uniform system and that different regions have different perceptions. So, for example, we talk of integrating China into the international system. But China never has had a conception of an international system composed of equal sovereign states. In the Chinese perception, until well into the 19th century, the world was, China was the central kingdom, and all the other states in the world had some tributary relationship to the Chinese empire. And indeed, they had no foreign policy, they had no foreign ministry, because they didn't accept the notion of the sovereign equality of states. Foreign policy was conducted out of the Ministry of Rituals, which was in charge of establishing the hierarchy. So when the first British ambassador showed up in Beijing, self-appointed, he had two propositions. One, that a British embassy should be established in Beijing. And secondly, that trade should start between the two countries. He was treated extremely well, but could not get an audience with the emperor. Finally, after 3 months, he presented his proposal, which he had to leave in written form on a chair where it then was. He could not hand it personally to the emperor. And he was told that it it was an absolutely absurd proposal. That, of course, the Chinese would be very happy to receive an ambassador, but he would have to wear Chinese clothes, live in a Chinese house, and would never be permitted to leave the country. So it would be an act of hospitality. As for trade, they said, we have everything that we need and that we could possibly want. If you want to buy some Chinese goods for cash, you can do it in Canton for I forget how many months, for a specified number of years. This was at a time when the Industrial Revolution had already started in China. And so the necessity, and it took another 40 years before the British could get what they wanted, and they had to shoot their way into China. And then that was followed by a century of various European intrusions. So the challenge for China today is it is aiming to become of a magnitude comparable to the existing superpowers, which essentially means us. But they have never had to conduct foreign policy in a status of equality. And therefore, the issue is to them, how does China fit into an international system? And they have two concepts that they are now exploring. One that was put forward by their president, namely, is it possible to create an international system in which two potentially adversarial countries work as partners, and how would that work? But they're hedging it with another approach, which says Asia for the Asians, and basically says, you stay on your side of the Pacific, we stay on ours. And the internal debates in China are going to be about which of these views will become dominant. And our problem is that we really don't think of foreign policy as a conceptual problem. We think of peace as the normal condition. So if there's an interruption, there has to be some evildoer to get punished. We think of foreign policy as a series of individual actions, as a series of programs that are limited in time. The Chinese think that every solution is an admission to another set of problems. We think a solution or an agreement interface of foreign policy, and then we go on to another one, which we generally don't recognize until there is a crisis. So what bothers me most in the relationship with China right now is that we have solved day-to-day problems more or less well. We have made both sides grandiose statements about ultimate objectives. But in the area between small unit tactics and grand strategy, we have not developed a way of discussing or a way of setting goals. So when the Chinese say their goal now is a Silk Road concept and a One Belt concept, what does this mean? And how do they view it? And how does it affect us? I mean, it's one set of issues. Then, of course, there's the Middle East. And there may be questions about it. I'll talk only about the number of revolutions that are going on there simultaneously. That is the upheaval of the downtrodden in a society against the upper classes. That exists elsewhere as well. The split between various ethnic groups. The fundamental split between Shia and Sunni. And the fact that the Middle East was imagined as a political region at the end of World War I, and that most of the states that were created there have no historical existence. There has never been an Iraq in this shape in human history. There has never been a Syria or a Jordan of this kind. Now, all of these states are breaking down because the European states were based on comparable history and similar language, identical language, or at least attempted to do it. The Middle Eastern states all have very straight line borders because they were made by diplomats in order to reflect the European balance of power. Among these states, only Iran can be said to have a historic existence in the sense that it was, though taken over by the Arabs, it is the only country forcibly converted to Islam that never gave up its language and always insisted on maintaining its culture. Now, in the midst of permanent revolutions, the United States finds it very difficult to position itself. So, at the end of, say, this current agreement, whatever you think of its specific quality with respect to nuclear weapons.
We're talking about the Iran
Iran
deal.
nuclear agreement. There will be two apocalyptic blocs, a Shia bloc and a Sunni bloc. Now, how does the United States conduct itself? And I'm not talking about the agreement. However this agreement comes out, this is the likely outcome. And how does the United States conduct itself between two groups? You can say like the balance of power of historic times. But the balance of power in Europe operated reasonably well because there were many components. Here we have only two, and they're both likely to have nuclear weapons at some stage. So that is the big challenge we will have, regardless who wins the election. The winner will have to deal with it. And then there is the transformation of Europe, which, if you read European history books written in the early 20th century or late 19th century, they exude a confidence in their future and a conviction of superior ability to organize the world. If you read in if you watch European politics today, there is, first of all, no great conviction of what role in the shaping of these events that I've described is taking place. I mean, what role Europe has, and so you have an economic bloc that has no political objectives and that cannot ask sacrifices of its population. And if you cannot ask sacrifices, you cannot build for the future. I could go on, and let me just mention Russia. I mean, on the one hand, one can look at Russia as a traditionally aggressive country, and that is certainly true. I mean, it has in its history probably started more wars than most other countries. At the same time, it has also contributed to the equilibrium of the global order against the Mongols, against the Swedes, against the French, and against the Germans. So the region between St. Petersburg and Vladivostok plays a crucial role in equilibrating the world. And, I do not want to start a debate about Putin now, but I'd like to call attention to one aspect. I mean, the great hero of Putin is Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky was not so much concerned with conquest as with Russian identity. He identified Russian identity with the spread of Russian values, but it was not simply a Hitlerian So these are just a few sketches, and here is the United States. It has to ask itself, where do we want the world to go? To what extent can we influence it? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to prevent? And how are we going to do this? And how can we do it over an extended period of time so that every time a new president comes in, we don't have to tear up all the trees to see what roots are still there, and to give us some predictability for other countries that are asking themselves the same question. So this is a very important moment for American history. I think more in terms of the philosophical questions that I've tried to raise than in every detail of Ukraine or nuclear agreements. And so I'm happy to be here, and I want to congratulate Ben Rosen for the imagination of doing this. When he first mentioned it, I thought I could easily promise that I would come, because I thought it might never happen.
Well, welcome to reality. Thank you for that, as always, elegant, I believe the French term is tour d'horizon. Apropos China, you told Alistair Horn some years ago, I think when he was writing your biography, that the United States really had no reason to be concerned with China's foreign policy, but you said to him, if they start to launch aircraft carriers, watch out. Well, they've since launched one aircraft carrier and are building two more. Should we be worried?
Well, the first aircraft carrier is a ship they bought from the Ukrainian Navy.
But an aircraft carrier, nonetheless. I mean,
yeah, it's an aircraft carrier.
It may leak, but it can launch planes with nasty things on them.
Yeah,
I mean, what I'm saying is,
the question is,
are they being expansionist?
I'm sure that the British asked the same question about the German Navy around 1900, and it turned out to be a threatening navy. It is conceivable that the Chinese think that world domination, whatever that means, requires a great navy. It would be a lot of waste of their resources, but it could happen. The issue is, I look at the relationship between China and the United States this way. There's no question that any of the leaders who went into war in 1914 would have recoiled with horror if they had known what the world would look like in 1918. And none of the objectives that people were at that time thinking were worth the loss of tens of millions of lives uh, stood up to reflection afterwards. So I think a war between China and the United States, almost by definition, cannot have any winners. I do not see what the Chinese would want to conquer that requires a navy.
What about those troublesome islands between Japan and China? Is World War III going to start with a dispute over those?
It's in the nature of things that when China and the United States are emerging as economic superpowers, that we are going to step on each other's toes. Now, the islands between China and the Philippines, I mean the so-called South China Sea, certainly if the Chinese decide that they want to conquer all of these islands and that these islands must become part of China, then a level of tension will develop between China and the United States, which has a high potential of escalating into a war. However, if one looks at the South China Sea, it's the way we look at the Caribbean, in which the Chinese have certain security interests, but they don't have to possess every island. Then there is the basis for some kind of understanding in which Chinese essential security interests are protected, and our vision of the world order will be taken into account. Of course, they cannot define security in a sense where no conceivable threat can exist, because that would be absolute power, and that we cannot let them have. But I think I have said what I'm saying here to the Chinese. I said, if you are trying to dominate the world, there'll be a clash. So the question is, can we find modes of working together in a world in which we will have weapons whose consequences we can't even describe, not just nuclear weapons, but who knows what the impact would be of a massive cyber attack on either side, by either side.
Well, speaking
So yes, they're building, they will have people with that argument, and so will we. And the challenge for the leaders on both sides is to do something for which there's not too much precedent in history, to raise the debate to a higher level.
I'll ask one or two more questions, and then we'll open it up. What, if you were still Secretary of State and the Chinese military was launching hundreds and thousands of hacks, cyber hacks, against, as they are, against American industry and the military, what would you do to get them to cut it out?
Of course, I would brilliantly solve it.
Well, it goes without saying. Walk us, walk us through what that conversation would sound like.
I'll tell you what I think about the cyber problem, about which I'm really technologically fairly ignorant. I think it is essential that there is a serious dialogue between China and the United States on the implications of cyber on each other. Because if they launch thousands of hack attacks on us, it's obvious that we have the same capacity, probably a superior capacity, to do it against them. And a way has to be found to bring this into some regulated system. If not, we're going to have some crisis. The definition of an out-of-control crisis is when either side is involved in something that affects its important interests, cannot calculate what the other side's motives are and therefore attempts to deal with it unilaterally. And that we have to avoid. And the Chinese ought to avoid it. Because, first of all, in their history, they have never had the notion of domination like the European countries and Russia had, partly because they were so overwhelmingly strong in relation to all their neighbors that it never had to be articulated. But repeatedly in my dealings with the Chinese, or in historic dealings with the Chinese, they will say the purpose of of some action is to gain respect, not to, and not respect in the American sense of personal respect, but it is based on that imperial notion of the majestic country that has to be treated with dignity. So I think when you look, for example, at their proposal, at their idea, which hasn't been discussed very much yet in this country, but which they have formally put forward, of the Silk Road and the belt that is a push into Central Asia by China. Well, you can explain that in economic terms. It's not necessarily a strategic advance. It makes them a participant with Russia, Iran, and us in that region. And if it doesn't, I don't know the answer to how this will develop, but I am extremely concerned with putting it entirely on a military platform and say that we're going to deal with it by military confrontations. This is not the Cold War, in which I had some part. And so I know that mentality. It was appropriate for the Cold War. It's not yet appropriate for China.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll go to you. Among the many people who are running for president is a former U.S. Secretary of State. So I have a two-part question. First, how does one judge the performance of a U.S. Secretary of State? And the second part of the question is, what is your evaluation of the performance of Hillary Clinton as U.S. Secretary of State?
You know, I won't answer that question.
Did you accept a contribution to attend her, whose wedding was it?
No, let me tell you.
No, but how do you judge the performance of a Secretary of State? By treaties signed?
There are many levels on which you can judge it. One is how well did he run the necessary foreign policy apparatus of the United States. Secondly, how well did they understand this world in which they found themselves? Third is, did they do anything that makes the world different after than before? So these are criteria. I have before all of this started, I have stated publicly that I have had a friendly relationship with Hillary Clinton, but that I would support the Republican candidate because I think a new look at foreign policy is necessary. I said that before there were any candidates, but I'm trying to get through the campaign without giving up personal friendships.
Are you, and this really will be my last question, are you currently advising any of the 19 Republican candidates? And what cabinet post are you seeking in the Trump administration?
Well,
Yes.
first of all, I would always have to wear a post against the danger of losing my wife.
Oh, that's right.
And you know what I would choose.
Yeah, it's very clear.
It would be a historic event to have a 94-year-old cabinet member.
Oh, you're still cagey. Well, we have 30 seconds to go, and I'm going to use that time to thank Dr. Kissinger for being with us this afternoon. I think everyone in the audience will take away with them a profound sense of Dr. Kissinger's knowledge and gratitude that when the going was very tough, as it was, that America had him. His personal story is all the more remarkable, having grown up as a Jew in Hitler's Germany, having left Germany, I think, Henry, at the age of 15, and then some short years after finding himself as a U.S. infantryman in a foxhole in the Battle of the Bulge. From there to Harvard, while at Harvard, advisor to Nelson Rockefeller, from there to National Security Directorate in the Nixon White House, from there to Secretary of State, and from there to his happily long, and I might even say protracted career as an eminence grise. But you, in a rather deflated age, you've certainly put the eminence back into the concept. And so I thank you, and I think we all join in thanking Dr. Kissinger.